"You're not coming inside tonight, Mom. Olivia doesn't feel comfortable having you at Christmas anymore," my son said as he stood in the doorway, his hand already halfway to closing it. The string lights above the porch flickered softly, casting warm golden circles across the snow that had started falling just an hour earlier, and for a moment I found myself staring at those lights instead of at his face, because it was easier to focus on something beautiful than to accept what I had just heard. I had spent 71 Christmases believing that family meant permanence, that love meant a seat at the table no matter how old you became, but there I was standing on the wooden steps of the house I had once decorated with paper snowflakes and cinnamon garlands, being told there was no longer room for me inside. I adjusted my wool coat, the same charcoal gray one Frank had bought me 15 winters ago at a department store downtown, and felt the familiar weight of the small wrapped gift in my gloved hands, something I had chosen carefully for Olivia despite the quiet way she had been erasing me from our lives for months. Behind Daniel's shoulder I could see the glow of the Christmas tree in the living room, tall and perfectly shaped, its ornaments arranged with the kind of precision that never came from children or old memories, but from someone who wanted everything to look new. I heard laughter too, bright and unfamiliar, the sound of guests who had never known me as anything more than an aging inconvenience. Daniel cleared his throat, not meeting my eyes. "It's just for tonight," he added, as if that made it gentler, as if exclusion could be softened by careful wording. I nodded slowly, the cold air tightening around my lungs, and realized that this was not the first time I had been left standing outside something that once belonged to me. The first snowflake landed on the back of my hand, melting instantly, and I remembered another Christmas Eve decades ago when Daniel had been 5 years old and refused to go to bed because he was afraid Santa would skip our house if the lights went out. I had sat beside him on the living room floor until midnight, reading the same picture book over and over, promising him that no one who was loved would ever be forgotten. The memory drifted through me like a distant song, both sweet and unbearable. "All right," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. I did not argue. I did not ask why. I simply turned away from the doorway that had once opened without question, the porch boards creaking softly beneath my sensible boots as I stepped down into the fresh snow. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way it gets on Christmas Eve, when every window glows and every driveway holds a car that belongs to someone who has been welcomed inside. I walked past the row of hedges Daniel had planted the year he proposed to Olivia, neat and symmetrical like everything else she had influenced him to become, and I realized that my absence from tonight's celebration had probably been planned long before I arrived with my neatly wrapped present and hopeful smile. The wind picked up slightly, sending a swirl of powder across the sidewalk, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck as I began the slow walk toward the corner. My house was only 3 blocks away, but the distance felt longer than it had that morning when I had baked pecan pie and roasted turkey breast in preparation for a dinner that no longer included me. I passed a group of teenagers laughing near a parked SUV, their breath rising in white clouds as they tossed snow at each other, and one of them glanced at me with a fleeting expression of curiosity, as if wondering why an older woman would be out alone on a night meant for belonging. I kept moving one step after another, the wrapped gift still clutched in my hand, until the music from Daniel's house faded into silence. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought began to form, quiet but insistent, like the first note of a song you cannot quite place. Frank had always told me that storms reveal what foundations are made of, that winter shows you which doors are truly yours. By the time I reached my own front porch, my cheeks numb and my heart strangely calm, I understood that being shut out of Christmas was not the end of my story. It was only the moment the story finally began. I closed the front door behind me and stood there for a long moment without turning on the lights, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of car tires crunching over snow outside, as if the whole world had decided to keep moving without noticing that something inside me had shifted forever. The house felt different that night, not empty exactly, but unfamiliar in the way a place can feel when you suddenly realize you are the only one left who remembers what it used to be. I set the wrapped gift on the small entry table and slowly unwound my scarf, brushing snow from my shoulders the way I had done every winter since Frank and I bought this place 38 years ago. Back then Christmas had meant noise and crowded rooms, and the smell of pine needles scattered across the hardwood floors because Daniel would drag the tree in before I could lay down the old quilt to protect the finish. I used to scold him gently for that. He used to laugh and promise he would do better next year. I turned on the lamp beside the sofa and its soft amber glow revealed the careful decorations I had put up earlier that week, silver tinsel draped along the mantel, the nativity set Frank carved by hand during his retirement, stockings hanging in a neat row even though there had not been enough feet to fill them for years. For a moment I simply stood there, taking it all in, noticing how the silence pressed in around me like heavy fabric. I did not cry. I had not cried when Daniel closed the door either. Instead I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the faucet squeaking the same way it always had, stubborn and familiar. On the counter sat the pecan pie I had baked that morning, its glossy surface uncut, the scent of brown sugar and toasted nuts still lingering faintly in the air. I remembered how Olivia had once complimented my baking during their first Thanksgiving together, how she had smiled in that polished way of hers and asked if I might write down the recipe for her. I had believed then that kindness could grow into affection if you were patient enough. Now I understood that some smiles are simply well-rehearsed performances. I carried the pie to the table and sat down across from the empty chair where Daniel used to sprawl after dinner, his long legs stretched out, his head tilted back as he described plans for the future that always seemed to include me. It was only in the past year that those conversations had begun to change. Calls became shorter. Invitations arrived later or not at all. Decisions were announced rather than discussed. I told myself it was natural. Children build their own lives. Mothers learn to step aside. Still, there had been small moments that unsettled me, like the afternoon I stopped by with a casserole and found Olivia rearranging family photographs on the hallway wall, placing newer frames at eye level while older ones quietly disappeared into a cardboard box. She had laughed when she noticed me watching and said she was just making things look more modern. I had nodded, pretending not to feel the strange chill that crept along my spine. Sitting there now with the untouched pie between my hands, I began to connect those scattered memories the way one pieces together a puzzle whose picture you never wanted to see. The night Daniel forgot my birthday because they were attending a networking dinner. The morning he suggested I might feel happier in a senior community closer to downtown. The way Olivia would take his arm and answer questions before he had the chance to speak. None of it had seemed cruel at the time. It had felt like the gradual shifting of seasons, inevitable and beyond my control. I rose from the table and walked to the window overlooking the backyard, where the old oak tree stood outlined in moonlight, its branches bare but unbroken. Frank had planted that tree the year Daniel was born, insisting it would outlast all of us if we cared for it properly. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and wondered whether care alone was ever enough to preserve what mattered most. Somewhere in the distance church bells began to ring midnight, their steady rhythm marking the official arrival of Christmas Day. I whispered a quiet greeting to the darkness, not in bitterness but in recognition, because I could feel something new taking root beneath the layers of disappointment. Being turned away from my own family celebration had stripped away the last of my illusions, leaving behind a clarity that was both frightening and strangely liberating. I did not yet know what I would do with that clarity, but as I switched off the lamp and let the house settle into shadow, I sensed that the coming days would demand more from me than silent endurance. They would demand that I finally decide what place I was willing to claim in a world that had begun to close its doors. The morning after Christmas arrived quietly, with pale winter light slipping through the kitchen blinds and settling across the table where the untouched pecan pie still waited like a question I had not yet answered. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well but because something inside me had refused to remain still, turning over thoughts the way a restless tide turns stones along the shore. I wrapped myself in my thick navy robe and moved through the house with deliberate calm, noticing how each small sound seemed sharper than before. The tick of the hallway clock, the distant rumble of a garbage truck, the low hiss of the coffee maker beginning its familiar ritual. For years my mornings had been guided by routine, shaped around the needs and schedules of other people, but that day there was only my own reflection waiting in the dark window above the sink. I studied the woman looking back at me, silver hair pulled loosely at the nape of her neck, blue eyes shadowed not by tears but by a dawning awareness that she had mistaken endurance for belonging. The phone rang just as I poured my first cup of coffee, its sudden shrillness slicing through the quiet like an unexpected truth. I let it ring twice before answering, steadying my voice out of habit. It was Helen. Her tone was gentle but edged with concern, as if she had already heard more than I had told her. She asked how my evening had been, And for a moment I considered giving the kind of polite answer women my age are trained to offer. The one that smooths over discomfort and keeps family matters safely hidden behind closed doors. Instead I told her everything. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, but with the same clear precision I might use to describe the weather. I told her about the porch lights and the laughter inside, about Daniel's careful avoidance of my eyes, about the way Olivia's silhouette had appeared briefly in the hallway before disappearing again like a shadow that did not wish to be recognized. Helen was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said something that settled heavily in my chest. She said she had seen Olivia meeting with a real estate attorney 2 weeks earlier, that she had assumed Daniel must be planning to sell the old family home now that wedding preparations were underway. The words did not shock me as much as they should have. Instead they felt like confirmation of a suspicion that had been growing quietly beneath the surface of my thoughts. After we hung up, I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the tree, its light still glowing softly even in daylight. Beneath its branches lay a small stack of unopened holiday cards, their cheerful designs suddenly out of place in a world that had shifted overnight. I began to sort through them one by one, pausing when I reached a cream-colored envelope addressed in Frank's unmistakable handwriting. For a second I simply stared at it, my heart beating with a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. He had always believed in planning for the future, in leaving careful instructions that would guide us when he no longer could. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, written in the steady script I had loved for more than 4 decades. He reminded me that promises made in love must also be protected with wisdom, that trust without awareness can become a quiet surrender. At the bottom he had listed the name of his attorney and a date circled in red, a date that was now only 3 days away. I leaned back against the sofa cushions and closed my eyes, letting the realization settle over me like falling snow. Perhaps being turned away from that doorway had not been an ending at all. Perhaps it had been an invitation to finally see the pattern I had been unwilling to acknowledge. I opened my eyes and looked around the room at the photographs lining the mantel, at the tree that had once symbolized warmth and continuity. For the first time in many months I did not feel like a guest in my own life. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. I did not call the attorney that morning even though Frank's letter rested on the coffee table like a quiet instruction waiting to be followed. Instead I chose to sit with the weight of it, to let the realization move through me slowly the way winter sunlight moves across the floor, revealing details you had never noticed before. I spent the afternoon walking from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, straightening picture frames that did not need straightening, opening drawers simply to remind myself that everything here still belonged to me. The house held decades of evidence that I had once been central to someone's world. The dent in the kitchen wall from when Daniel had practiced throwing a baseball indoors despite my warnings. The faint outline on the living room carpet where Frank's recliner had stood until the day we donated it to a neighbor who had lost his own furniture in a flood. Memory lived in these spaces with a stubborn persistence, refusing to be reorganized into something more convenient. As evening approached I found myself standing in the bedroom closet, staring at the row of coats and dresses that marked different seasons of my life. My hand paused on a deep green wool dress I had worn to Daniel's college graduation, the day he had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe and whispered that he would never forget everything I had sacrificed to get him there. I closed my eyes and allowed that memory to surface fully, the warmth of late spring sun, the sound of families cheering, the certainty that love, once given, could not simply be withdrawn like an invitation. Yet the past few months had been filled with moments that contradicted that belief. I remembered the afternoon Olivia suggested repainting the dining room because the burgundy walls felt too heavy for entertaining their friends. Daniel had nodded in agreement without asking how I felt about losing the color Frank and I had chosen together. I remembered the Sunday brunch where I discovered my usual seat had been taken by one of Olivia's colleagues, and no one thought to offer me another place at the table until the plates were already being cleared. At the time I had smiled and said it did not matter. I had convinced myself that adjustment was a form of generosity. Now I understood that repeated adjustment can slowly erase the outline of who you are. I returned to the living room and sat beside the old oak coffee table, unfolding Frank's letter once more. The date circled in red seemed to glow with new urgency as the sky outside darkened into shades of indigo. 3 days. That was all the time I had to decide whether I would continue pretending that exclusion was accidental or finally acknowledge the deliberate pattern shaping my future. The thought did not fill me with anger. Instead, it brought a strange sense of clarity, as if a fog that had surrounded me for years was beginning to lift. I rose and walked to the front window, watching as a thin layer of frost formed along the edges of the glass. Across the street, a young couple carried boxes into their new home, laughing as they struggled to keep their balance on the icy sidewalk. Their voices drifted faintly toward me, bright with possibility. I wondered whether they understood how fragile belonging could be, how easily the boundaries of family might shift when ambition or fear entered the room. My own reflection appeared beside theirs in the darkened pane, older but no longer uncertain. I realized then that the coming meeting with Frank's attorney was not simply about documents or decisions made long ago. It was about whether I would finally step into the role he had always believed I possessed, the role of someone capable of protecting her own place in the world. The house around me seemed to breathe with that realization, its familiar creaks and whispers no longer reminders of loneliness but signals that I was still here, still part of the story. I turned off the porch light and let the night settle in, carrying with it the quiet promise that whatever waited on the other side of those 3 days would demand more courage than I had shown in years, and that perhaps courage was exactly what this winter had been preparing me to find. I waited until the second morning before making the call because I wanted my voice to sound steady when I finally spoke his name aloud, the name of the man who had stood beside Frank through decades of contracts and negotiations, through expansions and setbacks, through the quiet preparation for a future we had once believed would unfold gently. The attorney answered on the third ring, his tone warm with recognition, as though he had been expecting me long before I found the courage to dial. We agreed to meet that afternoon at his office downtown, a place I had not visited since the week after Frank's funeral when grief had blurred every hallway into something indistinct and heavy. The drive there took 20 minutes in light winter traffic, but it felt like crossing an invisible border between the life I had tolerated and the life I was beginning to understand. Snow from the night before had been pushed into gray ridges along the sidewalks, and people hurried past wrapped in scarves and intentions that did not include me. I parked beside a row of bare maple trees and sat for a moment with the engine off, watching my breath cloud the windshield. Inside my handbag, Frank's letter rested like a compass pointing toward something inevitable. The office building looked unchanged, its brass directory polished to a dull shine, its elevator humming with the same tired determination I remembered. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, the scent of old paper and coffee greeted me like a familiar witness. He rose from behind his desk as I entered, his expression kind but serious, the way one looks at someone who is about to learn a truth that cannot be softened. We spoke first of ordinary things, of weather and health and the way time seems to accelerate after 70, but beneath that conversation I sensed the careful patience of a man who understood that timing matters more than words. Finally he reached into a drawer and placed a thick folder in front of me, its edges worn from being opened and closed many times without my knowledge. He reminded me that Frank had always believed in protecting not just wealth but dignity, that the documents inside were designed to ensure I would never be forced into decisions made for the convenience of others. As he spoke I realized how thoroughly I had underestimated my own position, how easily I had allowed the narrative of decline to replace the reality of quiet strength. The folder contained deeds, trust agreements, clauses written in language both precise and merciful, all confirming that the home Daniel now treated as a future investment remained irrevocably mine unless I chose otherwise. There were provisions too regarding financial accounts I had assumed were long settled, safeguards that could shift the balance of power with nothing more dramatic than a signature. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail the way one absorbs the changing light before a storm. Outside his window the city moved on in steady rhythms, people crossing intersections, buses kneeling to release passengers, life continuing with no regard for the transformation taking place inside a modest office suite. When he finished, he folded his hands and studied me quietly, as if measuring whether I would shrink from the responsibility Frank had placed in my path. Instead I felt something unexpected rise within me, not anger and not fear but a calm determination that settled like an anchor in deep water. I understood then that exclusion had been a test of sorts, an invitation to rediscover boundaries I had allowed to blur. We discussed next steps in practical terms, timelines and options, the kind of strategic clarity that had once intimidated me but now felt like a language I was finally ready to speak. As I left the building, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, turning every footprint into evidence of movement, of choice. I paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the pale winter sky, aware that the coming days would demand more than quiet observation. They would require action measured not in miles or dollars, but in the willingness to claim a voice that had been waiting patiently beneath years of polite silence. The drive home felt shorter than the drive into the city, not because the distance had changed, but because my thoughts had found a direction they had been missing for far too long. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as the winter sun faded into a pale gray horizon, the familiar streets of my neighborhood unfolding ahead like chapters one had read many times without fully understanding their meaning. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, its white siding dusted with remnants of snow, its front porch waiting with quiet patience, yet something in the air felt undeniably different. I was no longer returning as someone who hoped to be invited back into another person's plans. I was returning as someone who finally understood that her own plans mattered just as much. Inside, the warmth from the thermostat greeted me, along with the faint scent of evergreen from the tree that still stood illuminated in the corner. I set my handbag on the kitchen counter and removed the folder carefully, placing it beside the stack of unopened holiday cards like evidence I was not yet ready to reveal. For several minutes I simply stood there, listening to the soft ticking of the wall clock, and allowing the magnitude of what I had learned to settle into my bones. It was not triumph I felt. It was clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and then refuses to leave. I moved through the evening with deliberate calm, preparing a simple dinner for myself, heating leftover soup on the stove while the sky darkened outside the window. Every movement felt purposeful, as though I were rehearsing for a moment that had not yet arrived but would soon demand composure. After eating, I washed the dishes and dried them with the same blue-striped towel I had used for years, noticing how even the smallest routines could anchor a person when everything else seemed to shift beneath her feet. Later I sat at the dining table and began writing a list, not of grievances but of decisions. I wrote down the date of Daniel's engagement dinner, which I had learned about through a mutual acquaintance who assumed I was already planning what to wear. I wrote down the attorney's recommendations, the steps required to secure what Frank had entrusted to me. I wrote down a single sentence I wanted to remember when the time came to speak. The act of putting these thoughts on paper steadied me more than any comforting conversation could have. Outside, a thin wind brushed against the windows, carrying with it the distant sound of carols from a passing radio, a reminder that the season of celebration was still unfolding for others. I did not resent that. Instead, I felt a quiet separation from the expectations that had once defined my place in the world. Before going to bed, I walked once more through the living room, pausing beside the tree to switch off its lights. The room fell into shadow, but the darkness no longer frightened me. It felt like a canvas waiting for a new story. Upstairs, I chose the green wool dress from the closet and laid it neatly across the foot of the bed, smoothing its fabric with careful hands. I imagined the expressions I might see in a few days, the surprise, perhaps the discomfort, perhaps even the realization that silence does not always mean surrender. As I turned out the bedside lamp and lay beneath the heavy quilt Frank and I had shared through countless winters, I understood that preparation was not about confrontation. It was about reclaiming space, about stepping forward without raising my voice yet refusing to step back again. Sleep came slowly but without the restless dreams that had haunted me since that night on the porch. In their place was a steady awareness that the next chapter would be written not by exclusion or by fear, but by a choice I was finally ready to make. The day of the engagement dinner arrived wrapped in a thin veil of winter sunlight that seemed almost too gentle for what I knew it would reveal. I woke before dawn, not out of anxiety but because there was a certain stillness in the house that felt like an invitation to gather my thoughts one final time. The green wool dress lay exactly where I had placed it, smooth and composed, a quiet reminder that preparation is often an act of respect for oneself rather than for the occasion. I dressed slowly, fastening each button with deliberate care, choosing the pearl earrings Frank had given me on our 40th anniversary. The ones he said made me look as though I carried my own light wherever I went. Downstairs, the kitchen greeted me with the familiar scent of brewed coffee, and the soft hum of the heating vents pushing warmth into corners that had once felt too large for one person alone. I did not rush. I allowed the morning to unfold at its own pace, reviewing in my mind the list I had written days earlier, the names, the dates, the simple sentence that would anchor me when the time came to speak. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life with the quiet routines of a weekend, a newspaper landing on a porch across the street, a dog barking once and then falling silent, distant church bells marking the passing of hours that could not be reclaimed. By late afternoon I was ready. The folder rested securely in my handbag, its contents heavier in meaning than in weight, and as I locked the front door behind me I felt no hesitation. Daniel's house stood only a few blocks away, yet the walk there felt like crossing into a different landscape altogether, one shaped by expectations I had once accepted without question. When I arrived, the driveway was already filled with polished vehicles reflecting the fading light, and through the front windows I could see figures moving gracefully beneath the chandelier Olivia had insisted on installing last summer. Laughter spilled onto the porch in bright bursts, accompanied by the clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversations that paused only when I rang the bell. It was Daniel who opened the door. For a second his expression held nothing but surprise, as if he had forgotten that I still existed beyond the edges of his carefully arranged life. Then he stepped aside automatically, the habits of upbringing stronger than the new loyalties he had been trying to cultivate. I entered without hurry, aware of the way the room seemed to shift around my presence, the way Olivia's smile faltered just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. She approached me with a practiced warmth that no longer convinced me, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as though to remind both of them where her influence lay. I greeted the guests by name, accepting their compliments on my dress with the quiet grace I had carried through decades of gatherings, and allowed myself a moment to absorb the scene. The dining table was set with immaculate precision, centerpieces arranged to draw the eye toward the future they were celebrating, a future that until recently had been discussed as though it did not require my consent. As dinner progressed I listened more than I spoke, observing the subtle exchanges that revealed alliances and assumptions, the way decisions were mentioned casually as though already finalized. Daniel spoke about renovation plans for the property, about investment opportunities that would ensure stability for the years ahead. Olivia nodded in agreement, her gaze flicking toward me only briefly, perhaps to confirm that I remained the silent figure they expected. I waited until dessert was served, until the conversation reached that comfortable lull where attention begins to drift and truths can be introduced without spectacle. Then I set my fork down and reached for my handbag. The simple motion drew their eyes, in a way no raised voice ever could. When I placed the folder on the table the sound it made was soft but unmistakable, like a door closing gently yet firmly. In that instant I understood that this was not a confrontation but a declaration, the culmination of a journey that had begun on a snowy porch with a single sentence of exclusion. I looked at my son, at the woman he had chosen, and felt neither anger nor regret, only the steady certainty that silence had finally given way to something far more powerful. I opened the folder slowly, not to create suspense but because some truths deserved to be revealed with care rather than force. The soft murmur of conversation faded around me, replaced by the subtle tension that settles into a room when people sense a shift they cannot yet name. Daniel's hand, which had been resting casually beside his glass, moved closer to Olivia's as though seeking reassurance, while she maintained her composed smile, the same expression she had perfected for social gatherings where perception mattered more than sincerity. I drew out the first document and laid it flat on the polished surface of the table, smoothing its edges with the tips of my fingers as if arranging place settings for a meal that had taken years to prepare. My voice when I began to speak was calm enough to surprise even me. I explained that Frank had never believed in leaving important matters to chance, that he had structured our affairs with the quiet foresight of a man who understood how easily affection can be overshadowed by ambition. A few of the guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a private family matter, or something that would soon involve them as well. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the heading of the page, his brow furrowing as comprehension dawned in slow increments. Olivia's posture remained unchanged, but the light in her eyes sharpened, calculating, as though she were already searching for the angle that might turn this moment back in her favor. I continued without raising my tone, describing the ownership clauses that confirmed the house and its surrounding property would remain solely under my authority for as long as I chose to reside there, along with the financial safeguards that prevented any transfer or renovation without my explicit approval. The words felt less like accusations and more like a simple correction of a misunderstanding that had been allowed to grow unchecked. I spoke of respect, not as something owed automatically but as something demonstrated through actions both large and small. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to unease, and I realized he had never truly considered that my silence over the past year had been a form of observation rather than agreement. One of his colleagues cleared his throat softly, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness, and Olivia finally set down her fork with deliberate grace. She asked whether this revelation was meant to disrupt their plans, or merely to clarify my position. Her choice of words carried the faintest edge, the suggestion that my presence itself was an inconvenience to be managed. I met her gaze steadily and replied that clarity often feels disruptive to those who have grown comfortable with assumptions. I explained that I would not be selling the property, not now and not in the foreseeable future, and that any future decisions regarding it would be made on terms that honored the life Frank and I had built together. Around the table, shoulders straightened and hands paused mid-gesture, as if everyone were recalibrating their understanding of the dynamics they had walked into that evening. Daniel spoke then, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, asking why I had not told him sooner. I considered the question carefully before answering that timing is sometimes the only language people truly understand. The folder remained open between us like a map drawn after years of wandering without direction. I could feel the weight of unspoken histories pressing against the walls, memories of holidays and promises and gradual exclusions that had led us all to this precise moment. When I finished, I closed the folder with a gentle finality and rested my hands upon it, aware that the power of what I had said lay not in confrontation but in the certainty that I would no longer pretend to be uncertain about my place in the world. I remained seated for a moment after the last echo of my words dissolved into the quiet air, allowing the stillness to do what raised voices never could. Around the table, expressions shifted like clouds across a winter sky, uncertainty replacing the easy confidence that had filled the room earlier that evening. Daniel looked at me as though he were seeing not only his mother but the passage of years he had chosen not to notice, the quiet sacrifices that had formed the foundation of every opportunity he now took for granted. Olivia, for all her composure, could not entirely conceal the tightening at the corners of her mouth, the subtle recalculation of strategies that had once seemed effortless. I understood then that power rarely announces itself with noise. It arrives in clarity, in the simple act of refusing to be diminished. I spoke once more, not to accuse but to conclude. I told them that love does not require surrender, that belonging cannot be negotiated behind closed doors without consequence. I reminded Daniel of the promises he had made long before ambition and influence had reshaped his priorities, promises whispered in childhood bedrooms and repeated in graduation halls filled with applause. The room listened, not out of obligation but because truth, when spoken calmly, carries a gravity that commands attention. I gathered the documents with careful hands, sliding them back into the folder as though closing a chapter that had taken years to write. No one reached out to stop me. No one offered the easy reassurances that once might have satisfied me. Instead there was a recognition, dawning slowly across their faces, that the future they had planned would now require a different conversation. I rose from my chair and smoothed the fabric of my dress, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat beneath the pearls at my throat. Outside, through the tall windows, snow had begun to fall again, soft and persistent, covering the footprints left by arriving guests with a fresh layer of quiet possibility. Daniel stood as well, his voice hesitant when he asked whether we could talk later, just the two of us. I met his gaze without anger and told him that conversations built on respect are always worth having, but only when both sides are ready to listen. Olivia remained seated, her eyes following my movements with an intensity that suggested she was already weighing new paths forward, new ways to secure what she had once believed inevitable. I wished her well with genuine sincerity, not because I had forgotten the past but because I understood that bitterness would only tether me to a story I had finally outgrown. As I walked toward the door, the murmur of guests resumed behind me, softer now, threaded with speculation and the fragile awareness that they had witnessed something more significant than an engagement celebration. The porch light flickered on automatically as I stepped outside, illuminating the drifting snowflakes that caught briefly in my hair before melting away. The night air felt sharp and clean against my skin, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from another house where warmth had not been complicated by ambition. I paused at the top of the steps and looked back once, not in longing but in acknowledgement of what had been and what would never be again. Freedom, I realized, does not always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a single sentence spoken at the right moment, with the courage to walk away without waiting for permission. I descended the steps slowly, each footfall leaving a clear imprint in the fresh snow. A path leading not back into isolation but forward into a life I would shape with intention rather than fear. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the door behind me had already closed, yet for the first time in many winters I did not feel left outside. I felt as though I had finally stepped into a future that belonged entirely to me.